Welcome to Boring Owl, dear connoisseurs of historical discomfort, to the Roaring Twenties. And no, we're not talking about bathtub gin and flappers doing the Charleston until their ankles gave out. We're diving headfirst and probably a little disgusted into the real heart of the roar, the cash that fueled it, and the very select, very insulated individuals who hoarded most of it. Imagine, if you will, a decade where the pursuit of wealth wasn't just a goal, but a competitive sport played with diamond-crusted rackets and custom-built yachts. A time when New York City, already a monstrous beast of concrete and ambition, truly began to flex its financial muscles, inflating like some grotesque economic soufflé that only a handful of people would ever get to taste. This wasn't just wealth. This was unprecedented, often vulgar, obscenely displayed wealth. A kind of prosperity so utterly self-congratulatory, it practically had its own theme music, probably played by a very bored orchestra in a gilded ballroom. Now, you might be picturing elegant gentlemen in top hats and ladies draped in pearls, sipping champagne on velvet settees, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But peel back that thin, polished veneer, and you find something far more fascinating and, frankly, a bit more pathetic. Our focus today isn't on the diligent industrialists or the clever financiers who built these empires. Oh, no, that would require too much respect. We're here to explore the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of their opulence, the vast, yawning chasm between their staggering fortunes and the actual utility of their lives. We're talking about the kind of money that ceased to be about comfort and instead became a bizarre form of performance art, a constant, exhausting demonstration of because I can. It was a world where a man might own a dozen houses and still feel homeless, where a woman possessed an entire jewelry store and yet felt utterly invisible. Prepare yourselves, because we're about to wade through oceans of silk, inhale decades of cigar smoke, and perhaps, just perhaps, be bored into a quiet, existential stupor by the sheer pointlessness of it all. This isn't just history. It's a social experiment in how much money you can throw at a problem before the problem becomes you. And the joke, as always, is on everyone involved. Now, if you want to understand the Gilded Age's encore, the Roaring Twenties, you must first understand its architecture, because these people didn't just live in houses, they erected monuments to their own arrogance. Picture yourself, if you dare, strolling down Fifth Avenue, past the nascent public library and the burgeoning skyscraper canyons. What truly dominates your vision are these hulking, stone-faced behemoths, each one a defiant declaration of wealth. These weren't homes, they were urban fortresses, built on foundations of old money, new money, and more than a little hubris. We're talking about French chateaux, painstakingly reconstructed brick by brick, Italian Renaissance palaces airlifted from Florence, and Gothic cathedrals repurposed for domestic living, complete with gargoyles that looked suspiciously like disapproving ancestors. And then, if the city proved too urban for their delicate sensibilities, they decamped to the sprawling estates of Long Island. The Hamptons, Newport. These weren't mere retreats, they were battlegrounds for social supremacy, where one's summer cottage could boast more rooms than a decent-sized hotel. Imagine waking up in a house so vast you needed a compass and a Sherpa just to find the breakfast room. These places, often mock Tudor or colonial revival on steroids, had names like Ohaka Castle or Marble House, names that screamed, "We have so much money, we bought a concept." They were designed for grandeur, for intimidation, for the explicit purpose of making anyone who didn't live there feel profoundly inadequate. Their sheer size wasn't about comfort, it was about distance. Distance from the hoi polloi, distance from reality, and often distance from any discernible human warmth. The upkeep alone could fund a small nation. Imagine the heating bill. Imagine the sheer soul-crushing effort required to simply exist within these gilded mausoleums. The practicalities were, of course, someone else's problem, always. Step inside, if you can even find the front door without accidentally wandering into a minor wing designated for seasonal shrubbery. What greets you is not warmth, nor coziness, nor anything remotely resembling a home where actual humans might relax. Oh no, you are entering a museum, a shrine to the owner's inflated ego, meticulously curated by architects and interior designers whose primary directive was more. Imported Italian marble floors, so polished you could skate across them, reflecting the impossibly intricate, gilded ceilings that depicted cherubs frolicking with forgotten Greek gods. Tapestries so ancient and fragile, they felt like whispers of forgotten centuries, hanging alongside original Impressionist paintings, not because the owner necessarily appreciated art, but because Monet and Renoir were simply better investments than, say, a sensible mutual fund. Every surface was a statement, every piece of furniture a declaration. Think chairs carved with the faces of mythological beasts, sofas upholstered in silks so fine they felt like cobwebs, and tables so heavy they required a small team of oxen to shift. These weren't for sitting, darling, they were for display. You certainly wouldn't put your feet up, lest you scuff the pristine Louis XV leg or offend the ghost of some long-dead French aristocrat whose chair this once was. The air itself seemed to hang heavy with the scent of aged wood, expensive polish, and the faint, unsettling perfume of money left too long in the sun. It was an environment designed to be awe-inspiring and utterly unlivable. A gilded cage indeed, where even the gilded birds probably longed for a simpler branch to perch upon. The idea was to live surrounded by beauty, but the reality was often to live surrounded by monuments to one's unending capacity for acquisition. Comfort? That was for the help, and even then, only sparingly. Now, all this opulent absurdity, these veritable palaces of pretension, they didn't just run themselves. Oh no. Behind every perfectly polished silver spoon and every immaculately pressed linen napkin stood an invisible army. A silent, suffering legion of humanity whose sole purpose was to facilitate the profound boredom of the rich. You see, the true luxury of the 1920s elite wasn't just having money. It was having so much money that you outsourced the very act of living to an entire social stratum. Let's begin with a roll call, shall we? You had your butlers, the regal orchestrators of the household symphony, who could discern a social faux pas from 20 paces and serve a 5-course meal with the solemnity of a high priest. Beneath them, the footmen, glorified human props, primarily for opening doors and looking good in livery, perhaps occasionally moving a piece of furniture that weighed more than a small horse. For the ladies, maids, parlor maids, chambermaids, personal maids, An endless hierarchy of women whose days were spent scrubbing, polishing, dusting, and generally erasing any trace of human imperfection from these perfect homes. And of course, the cooks, presiding over infernal kitchens, conjuring up elaborate feasts from dawn till dusk, often without ever seeing the faces of the people they fed. Chauffeurs idled in garages, brimming with custom automobiles, ever ready to whisk their masters from one tedious engagement to another. Then there were the governesses and tutors, tasked with civilizing the mini aristocrats, instilling good manners and an appropriate disdain for anyone not of their station. The laundresses, whose hands were perpetually pruned from battling mountains of delicate silks and linens. The scullery maids, scraping the detritus of those multi-course meals from countless plates, often working in dank, subterranean conditions. And for the vast estates, gardeners, whole retinues of them, meticulously clipping hedges, manicuring lawns, and coaxing exotic flora into submission, all to create a backdrop for another utterly pointless tea party. You might have seen these people, if you were really looking, flitting through hallways, down back staircases, like ghosts in a particularly well-maintained Gothic novel. Their presence was essential, their existence largely ignored. This brings us to the delicious irony, the darkly comedic contrast that permeated these gilded lives. The masters and mistresses, in their silken robes and imported finery, would complain of a slight draught, a tardy cup of tea, or the egregious lack of a specific kind of artisanal toast. Meanwhile, mere feet beneath them, separated by a floorboard or a thin wall, their staff were enduring 16-hour days, often 6 or even 7 days a week, for wages that barely kept them from outright starvation. While the rich fretted over the cut of a new gown, the laundress fretted over rent. While the master pontificated on the stock market, the scullery maid scrubbed pans until her hands bled. The staff had their own intricate social hierarchy, their own rigid rules, their own clandestine romances and simmering resentments, a parallel universe of genuine human drama unfolding in the shadows of the main spectacle. They were the true custodians of the wealthy's comfort, the unseen gears in the colossal machine of luxury. They polished the silver, but never ate from it. They prepared the feasts, but subsisted on scraps. They raised the children, but were never truly family. The true cost of this luxury wasn't just measured in dollars. It was measured in exhaustion, in dignity lost, in lives sublimated to the whims of others. And the beautiful, terrifying truth is, the rich were largely oblivious. Or perhaps more accurately, willfully oblivious. Because acknowledging the suffering beneath your feet might just chip away at that pristine, polished surface of your own manufactured bliss. And we certainly couldn't have that, could we? Now, let's turn our gaze to the gentleman of means, the patriarch who, by some twist of fate or ruthless inheritance, found himself entombed in this particular golden cage. His mornings, one might imagine, were a symphony of effortless grace. You'd be imagining wrong. Even the act of waking was a laborious, multi-stage production, often involving assistants. You, as this imagined gentleman, wouldn't simply roll out of bed. Heaven forbid. A valet, a phantom of sartorial precision, would already be silently selecting your attire for the day, because choosing your own socks was clearly beneath you, or perhaps too cognitively demanding after a night of, well, of being rich. Your clothes, laid out with surgical precision, weren't just clothes, they were armor, each piece chosen not for comfort, but for the exacting demands of social presentation. The crisp shirt, the bespoke suit, the perfectly knotted tie, each required the kind of meticulous dressing that could take longer than some people's entire work shifts. And then the ritual of breakfast. Not a hurried grab and go like some frantic modern commuter. Oh no, this was a stately, multi-course affair, served with unwavering solemnity by an attendant who likely had already been up for hours preparing it. Freshly squeezed orange juice, perhaps a perfectly poached egg, bacon precisely rendered to an enviable crispness, toast from bread baked that morning, coffee that had traveled halfway across the globe just to grace your cup. All consumed in an atmosphere that often felt less like a meal and more like a private, utterly silent play where you were the sole, somewhat bored audience member. The profound boredom that must have accompanied such a lack of genuine effort in one's own existence. It must have been truly exhausting to be so utterly untaxed. So, with the arduous task of existing through breakfast completed, what did these titans of industry, these architects of prosperity, do with their days? What was the work of wealth? It was, in a word, performative. Much of it revolved around club memberships. Think of your modern social media feed, but in physical form, requiring actual pants and far more expensive drinks. There were the men's clubs, the Union, the Metropolitan, the Knickerbocker, hallowed halls of mahogany and cigar smoke, where important conversations about finance and politics were whispered over brandies. In reality, it was often more about proving you still belonged, exchanging perfunctory pleasantries, and occasionally engaging in a game of billiards that was less about sport and more about demonstrating a refined idleness. Perfunctory business meetings might occur, usually involving a junior partner presenting a sheaf of papers that had already been thoroughly vetted by a phalanx of financial advisors. Your role was to nod sagely, perhaps offer a single cryptic comment, and then dismiss yourself for a leisurely lunch. Afternoon affairs might include a visit to your tailor, a quiet afternoon at the races, or perhaps a clandestine rendezvous with a mistress in a discreet Fifth Avenue apartment, a pursuit that, while ethically dubious, at least offered a modicum of genuine human engagement amidst the manufactured existence. Or, most damningly, they might simply exist. A protracted stroll through Central Park, a long bath, several hours staring blankly at the wall, pondering the true meaning of a life entirely devoid of meaningful struggle. The constant search for distraction from their own vacuity was, perhaps, the only truly strenuous activity they undertook. Because when every need is anticipated, every desire met, and every obstacle removed, what exactly is left to do? The answer, depressingly, was often very little. And sometimes that very little led to a lot of gin. If the gentleman's day was a leisurely lament, then the wealthy woman's existence was a finely choreographed social gauntlet. Her morning, much like her male counterparts, began not with an alarm clock and a frantic scramble, but with an elaborate, almost ceremonial waking. You, as our lady of leisure, would be gently roused by a maid who had likely been awake for hours, preparing your bath, selecting your day's ensemble, and probably wondering if her own future involved slightly less back-breaking labor. The dressing ritual itself was an intricate dance, a veritable production starring you and your lady's maid. Layers of silk stockings, delicate lingerie, the precisely fitted day dress chosen for the specific social demands of the upcoming hours. No wrinkle, no stray hair, no smudge of kohl could be permitted. The pressure to always appear flawless, effortlessly elegant, was immense. It was a full-time job, simply to project the image of someone who didn't have a full-time job. And then, the breakfast, another stately tableau where conversation might range from the most recent society scandal to the utterly trivial details of a planned garden party, all served on exquisite china by an equally exquisite staff. Once the morning's personal beautification ritual was complete and the ceremonial breakfast concluded, the wealthy woman plunged headfirst into her social schedule, a meticulously planned itinerary of engagements designed less for genuine interaction and more for the subtle, continuous reinforcement of her social standing. First up, perhaps, a charity luncheon. Now, don't mistake this for altruism in its purest form. While some good might have accidentally been done, the primary function of these luncheons was to see and be seen. It was an arena for displaying the newest fashions, the most dazzling jewels, and the most recent social connections. Who sat at your table? Was it Mrs. Astor, of Vanderbilt? The wrong seating arrangement could spark a cold war of social slights that would reverberate through the entire season. It was less about giving to the poor and more about demonstrating you were wealthy enough to pretend to care about the poor, while simultaneously securing your position among the ultra-rich. Afternoon might bring a series of dress fittings, because one simply could not have too many gowns, especially when different events demanded wildly different sartorial statements. Hours were spent with couturiers, agonizing over the drape of chiffon or the placement of a single pearl, a truly exhausting ordeal. Then, the ubiquitous afternoon teas. More opportunities for polite gossip, strategic alliances, and the quiet, almost undetectable, sabotage of rivals. And of course, the ubiquitous bridge games. Hours spent shuffling cards and making bids, a genteel facade for intense, often ruthless, social maneuvering. Every conversation, every interaction, was a careful performance, a delicate balance of charm and strategic calculation. The eternal quest for social ascendancy was not a hobby. It was a full-time, emotionally draining occupation, a relentless pursuit of prestige that often left these women feeling utterly isolated amidst their gilded lives. They were queens of their meticulously curated castles, but those castles often felt like very beautiful, very lonely prisons. Now, let's talk about the armor these people wore into battle, the veritable shields and cloaks of status that draped their privileged forms, their wardrobes. For the wealthy of the 1920s, clothing wasn't just about covering one's nakedness, it was a declaration of war, a public performance of prosperity, and a crushing, self-imposed burden. Imagine, if you will, opening your closet, if you can even call it that. It's more like a dedicated wing of a small museum, and seeing not just dozens, but hundreds of outfits. Each one meticulously chosen, lovingly crafted, and strategically deployed for different times of day and social occasions. You had your morning frocks, your afternoon ensembles, your tea dresses, your dinner gowns, your ball gowns, your motoring coats, your golf attire, your riding habits, your negligées that probably cost more than a small car. The sheer number of garments was staggering, but so too was the cost. These weren't off-the-rack department store specials. Oh no, we're talking about custom-made pieces from Parisian haute couture houses like Chanel, Poiret, and Lanvin. Each stitch whispered, "I am vastly expensive." The practicality of 1920s high fashion, especially for women, was, shall we say, non-existent. Think layers of silk, lace, and delicate fabrics that required a team of maids to put on and take off. Dresses that were beautiful to behold, but restrictive to wear, often designed more for the passive display of wealth than for comfortable movement. The long, elegant lines, the dropped waists, the intricate beadwork, it all looked divine in a photograph, but imagine trying to navigate a crowded ballroom in something that felt like a beautifully embroidered straitjacket. Every social occasion demanded a fresh, sartorial statement, a constant rotation that ensured you were never seen in the same outfit twice, lest anyone whisper that your fortune was, heavens forbid, dwindling. It was an exhausting, expensive, and utterly pointless parade. And what did one drape oneself in, if not shimmering silks and meticulously tailored wools? One draped oneself in cold, hard, sparkling cash. Jewelry and accessories were not mere adornments. They were portable declarations of unimaginable wealth, screaming, "I am vastly, impossibly wealthy," with every glint. Diamonds, not just in rings, but in intricate necklaces that cascaded like frozen waterfalls, in tiaras that announced your arrival before you even stepped into the room. Pearls, ropes of them, sometimes 7 strands deep, a creamy, iridescent cascade that whispered of oysters plundered and fortunes spent. These weren't just gifts, they were heirlooms, investments, and more importantly, social weaponry. Furs, too, were essential. Ermine, mink, fox, draped over evening gowns, lending an air of decadent warmth and an unmistakable scent of luxury and slight animal cruelty. Imagine wearing a mink coat that cost more than most people's annual salary simply to attend a dinner party. The concept of statement pieces reached its apotheosis in the Roaring Twenties. A woman's entire persona could be encapsulated in the shimmering cascade of her diamond riviere or the weight of her pearl choker. These jewels weren't chosen for their subtle beauty, but for their sheer, unadulterated bling. They were designed to catch the light, to draw the eye, to silence any potential whispers of financial insecurity. They were tangible proof that you had not merely arrived, but that you had bought the entire damn train station, and probably the railway company too. And if anyone dared question your taste, well, the sheer monetary value of the pieces usually shut them up. It was a beautiful, suffocating burden, this obligation to be constantly, ostentatiously, blindingly rich. Now, let's turn our attention to the epicenters of their domestic grandiosity, the dining rooms, because the wealthy of the 1920s didn't just eat, they embarked on culinary marathons, elaborate feasts that were less about sustenance and more about sheer, unadulterated spectacle. Imagine yourself seated at a dining table that could comfortably host a small battalion, groaning under the weight of silver, crystal, and enough courses to induce a food coma in a professional competitive eater. A typical dinner, prepared by a private chef who commanded a small army of kitchen staff, might begin with an elaborate consommé, perhaps turtle soup, a delicacy that required both exotic ingredients and a certain degree of ethical detachment. This would be followed by a fish course, sole Veronique perhaps, or poached salmon with hollandaise, gleaming under the chandelier light. Then the roasted game, perhaps pheasant or partridge, presented with theatrical flourish, carved tableside by a highly trained footman whose primary skill was the precise severance of poultry limbs. Alongside this, an array of vegetables, often forgotten in the grand scheme of things, but prepared with meticulous care. Then a palate cleanser, a sorbet, perhaps, to prepare you for the next onslaught. And then the main event, a roast of beef, or lamb, or perhaps venison, a truly monumental slab of meat, accompanied by rich sauces and gravies. This would be followed by a cheese course, an array of imported varieties that would put your local Whole Foods to shame. Finally, a series of desserts, mousse, tarts, jellies, soufflés, each one a miniature work of art, designed to ensure you left the table not nearly full, but utterly, gloriously engorged. The sheer amount of food consumed was staggering, a testament to their boundless appetites and the limitless resources at their disposal. It was a caloric arms race, a daily reminder that they could literally eat the world if they so chose. And sometimes it felt like they tried. And then, of course, there was the drink. Because the 1920s, let's not forget, was the era of prohibition. A national experiment in enforced sobriety that, for the filthy rich, was little more than a thrilling suggestion, a minor inconvenience to be elegantly sidestepped. How did they navigate this paradox? With a truly magnificent display of hypocrisy and impunity. Your private cellars, already stocked with venerable vintages from before the Volstead Act, simply became more exclusive, more secretive. The finest French champagnes, the rarest Scotch whiskies, the most exquisite cognacs, all were hoarded, treasured, and consumed behind closed doors, often beneath a polite smile that suggested you were merely sipping a rather potent iced tea. But it wasn't just about old stock. A thriving, highly lucrative black market emerged, ensuring a steady supply of contraband. Exclusive speakeasies, often requiring secret handshakes and whispered passwords, catered solely to their elite clientele. Smuggled liquor, arriving by yacht from Canada or the Caribbean, was often delivered directly to their back doors, or more likely, their private docks. The thrill of illegal cocktails, the whispered glamour of a hidden gin joint, only added to the allure. For the rich, prohibition wasn't a moral crusade. It was a rather charming game of cat and mouse, a chance to demonstrate their ability to transcend trivial laws that applied only to the less fortunate. While the working classes risked arrest for a bottle of rot-gut moonshine, the wealthy sipped perfectly crafted martinis, their glasses clinking with the sound of defiant privilege. It was a testament to the fact that money could buy you many things, and one of the most important was the ability to completely ignore the law when it suited you. Cheers to that, I suppose. If you thought their dining habits were theatrical, wait until you experience the grand balls and soirees. These weren't mere gatherings, they were meticulously staged productions. A full-throttle social whirlwind where every glance, every conversation, every choice of costume was a calculated performance. Imagine receiving an embossed invitation, perhaps tied with a silken ribbon, summoning you to a mansion transformed. The air, heavy with the scent of 1,000 cut flowers and expensive perfumes, thrumming with the muffled strains of a full orchestra hired exclusively for the evening. The mansion itself would be unrecognizable, draped in silks, adorned with exotic plants, and illuminated by 1,000 flickering candles or newly installed electric lights that bathed the scene in an ethereal glow. Guest lists were carefully curated, a delicate balance of established titans, rising stars, and just enough foreign aristocracy to lend an air of cosmopolitan glamour. These parties were a crucible of social maneuvering, a grand game of chess played with champagne flutes and whispered intentions. Who was dancing with whom? Whose dress was the most avant-garde? Who managed to secure a private conversation with the formidable Mrs. Vanderbilt? Every interaction was an opportunity to advance one's social standing, to solidify an alliance, or to subtly undermine a rival. The competition was fierce, unspoken, and utterly exhausting. These weren't just parties, they were battlegrounds for reputation, where the only prize was continued relevance in the suffocatingly small world of high society. And in this glittering arena, etiquette wasn't just a suggestion, it was an ironclad constitution. The unwritten rules of social engagement were complex, unforgiving, and utterly baffling to the uninitiated. You dared not arrive too early, nor too late. You absolutely must RSVP, and your response would be scrutinized. Your attire, naturally, had to be impeccable, suitable for the occasion, and subtly, or not so subtly, superior to your peers. The pressure to host such events was immense, a non-negotiable obligation for anyone wishing to maintain their social standing. Failure to host an appropriately lavish function could lead to social ostracization, a fate far worse than financial ruin for many of these individuals. But it wasn't just about hosting. The pressure to attend every significant event, to be seen, to network, to make all the correct appearances, was equally draining. Imagine spending your evenings flitting from one grand ballroom to another, engaging in superficial conversation, forcing polite smiles, all while your feet ached and your head throbbed from the sheer volume of polite small talk. The exhaustion of maintaining appearances at all times, of always being on, must have been soul-crushing. There was no room for genuine emotion, no space for authentic connection, only the endless performance of wealth and social grace. You were a player in a never-ending play, and the curtain never truly fell. And somewhere, in the background, a very tired string quartet played another waltz, its music a faint, mournful accompaniment to the relentless pursuit of prestige. As the suffocating heat of a New York summer descended, rendering the city a malodorous, sticky beast, the wealthy performed their annual migration. They didn't just leave the city. They staged a full-scale evacuation, transplanting their entire existence and a substantial portion of their invisible army of servants to their summer cottages. And let's be abundantly clear, these weren't cottages in the humble, rustic sense. Oh no, we're talking about sprawling estates in places like the Hamptons on Long Island, or the verdant, windswept cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island. These summer retreats were often grander, more ostentatious, and frankly, more ridiculous than their city mansions. Imagine a 50-room cottage with ocean views, multiple ballrooms, and enough staff to run a small cruise ship. The very term cottage was a delicious piece of euphemistic irony, a subtle nod to modesty that utterly failed to conceal the colossal scale of their wealth. These were gilded prisons with sea breezes, where the primary objective was not relaxation, but the continuation of their highly structured, intensely competitive social lives, simply transposed to a more scenic backdrop. Every aspect of their city existence, from their rigid dining schedules to their elaborate dressing rituals, was faithfully reproduced in their summer abodes. The cooks cooked, the maids dusted, the chauffeurs drove, the governesses tutored, all for the benefit of masters and mistresses who now wore linen rather than wool, but were no less demanding or profoundly bored. The transplantation of their entire retinue of staff was a logistical nightmare for the servants, but for the rich, it was merely another invisible act of domestic magic, ensuring their comfort remained unbroken, their lives uninterrupted by the harsh realities of the season. With the summer migration complete, the rich turned their attention to recreation. And here, again, we encounter the meticulously structured, intensely exclusive activities designed less for genuine enjoyment and more for the reinforcement of social standing. Golf, for instance, wasn't just a game. It was a networking opportunity, a chance to display your prowess, or your carefully cultivated incompetence, if that was your particular brand of charm, on the links of an exclusive country club. Tennis, too, was a ritual, played in pristine white attire, followed by a polite tea. Yachting, of course, was paramount. Imagine a magnificent schooner, its sails billowing, cutting a clean path through the Atlantic, a symbol of freedom and adventure. Now imagine its owner, probably quite bored, sipping a cocktail while his crew did all the actual work, the yacht serving primarily as a backdrop for a very exclusive party or a demonstration of nautical superiority. Polo, the sport of kings, and anyone wealthy enough to maintain a stable of ponies and a dedicated staff to care for them, was another vital component of their structured leisure. These weren't hobbies. They were highly formalized, incredibly expensive social rituals designed to exclude as much as they were designed to entertain. The very act of participation solidified your position within the elite, ensuring that the walls of the golden cage remained firmly in place, even when bathed in sunlight and sea air. And through it all, the unspoken truth remained. Even leisure, when stripped of genuine spontaneity and infused with relentless social pressure, could be a profoundly exhausting and ultimately unfulfilling endeavor. Pass the iced tea, won't you? If you wanted to understand the pecking order of the 1920s wealthy, you didn't need to check their bank accounts. You just needed to look at their driveway. Because for the filthy rich, transportation wasn't merely about getting from point A to point B. It was a gleaming, roaring declaration of status, a kinetic sculpture of their financial might. Picture this. A hulking, magnificent machine, perhaps a Rolls-Royce Phantom, its polished chrome glinting under the New York sun, its engine humming with quiet, authoritative power. Or perhaps a Duesenberg, custom-built, impossibly luxurious, a land yacht designed to glide effortlessly through a world that largely walked. These weren't just cars. They were bespoke marvels of engineering and craftsmanship, often costing more than a small mansion. The interiors were a symphony of Connolly leather, polished wood veneers, and custom fittings that whispered money in every conceivable language. And at the wheel? Not the owner, heaven forbid, but a uniformed chauffeur, often resplendent in livery, cap, and pristine white gloves, a visible marker of wealth that announced your arrival before your tires even touched the curb. The leisurely, traffic-free drives, because traffic, like poverty, was largely for other people, were less about efficient travel and more about a mobile display of unassailable prestige. Imagine gliding through city streets, insulated from the noise and grime by layers of thick glass and custom upholstery, watching the less fortunate scurry past like ants. It must have been truly delightful, in a profoundly detached sort of way. These vehicles were not just transport, they were extensions of their owners' identities, symbols of a life lived above the fray, untroubled by the mundane mechanics of public transit. But why stop at mere automobiles when you could traverse the entire planet in bespoke splendor? For longer journeys, the wealthy embraced private rail cars. Imagine your own personal palace on wheels, detached from the communal indignity of a public passenger train. A private chef, dedicated staff, a lavish bedroom, a dining room, and even a small lounge car for entertaining. You could cross continents, entirely insulated. Your journey a seamless extension of your opulent home life, the landscape flashing by like a series of expensive postcards. And then, for those who truly understood the subtle art of conspicuous consumption, there were yachts. Not mere pleasure boats, but floating mansions, equipped with every imaginable luxury, from grand salons to multiple staterooms, all designed to transport you from one exclusive port to another without ever brushing shoulders with a commoner. These yachts were not just for sailing, they were for entertaining, for throwing parties at sea, for demonstrating an oceanic level of wealth. And as the decade wore on, a nascent, thrilling world emerged: private aviation. Imagine the thrill, the sheer audaciousness of chartering your own plane, or even owning one. To literally rise above it all, to view the world from a perspective only afforded to the gods and the impossibly rich. Travel for them wasn't about destination, it was about the journey, a secluded, unbothered affirmation of one's inviolable place at the very apex of society, a bubble of privilege floating serenely through the heavens or gliding across the waves. The rest of us could simply gaze upwards and marvel at their effortless ascent. Now, for most of us, business implies spreadsheets, meetings, deadlines, and a faint, lingering scent of existential dread. For the filthy rich of the 1920s, especially those of old money stock, the business of being born rich was an entirely different beast. It was less about active striving and more about elegant maintenance. You see, when you inherited an empire, the primary goal wasn't to build a new one, though some did, often for sport. It was to manage the existing one, to ensure its continued growth without ever appearing to exert oneself unduly. Actual work was, frankly, a bit vulgar. So, how did they accomplish this Herculean task of not working? They employed an army of very intelligent, very discreet individuals. Trustees, those venerable guardians of inherited fortunes, managed the intricate legal frameworks designed to preserve wealth across generations. Investment bankers, with their quiet suits and even quieter smiles, handled the actual messy business of making more money, ensuring portfolios blossomed without requiring any active input from the beneficiaries. Legal teams, a veritable battalion of them, stood ready to fend off any challenges, from minor property disputes to full-blown inheritance battles. The rich orchestrated this intricate dance of accumulation and preservation from a comfortable distance, often from the hallowed halls of their clubs or the decks of their yachts. Their role was to nod sagely, sign papers occasionally, and project an air of effortless command. It was a strategic ballet of not appearing to work too hard while still, somehow, inevitably, accumulating even more. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled, perhaps, was convincing the rich that their wealth was self-sustaining. And then we have strategic philanthropy. Oh, the delicate art of giving back. Not because one necessarily felt a profound sense of civic duty, but because it looked rather good in the society pages and offered some delightful tax advantages. Charitable donations and endowments were less about genuine altruism and more about securing social standing, burnishing a family name, or, quite frankly, avoiding the sticky inconvenience of taxes. Imagine a grand donation to a university, ensuring that a new library or academic wing would bear your family's illustrious and slightly self-congratulatory surname for generations to come. Or funding an art museum, allowing you to offload some of your less favored but still immensely valuable pieces from your private collection, all while being lauded as a patron of the arts. It was a brilliant sleight of hand. You gave away a fraction of your wealth, often to institutions that catered to people much like yourselves, and in return, you received public adoration, an elevated social status, and a hefty deduction on your income tax. The genuine grassroots charities, the ones actually dealing with the grime and hardship of poverty, rarely saw a dime. Why bother with the unglamorous work when you could put your name on a grand marble edifice? It was philanthropy as public relations, charity as a strategic investment in one's own legacy. A cynical look, perhaps, but often a highly accurate one. After all, what's the point of having all that money if you can't use it to buy a little immortality and a tax break along the way? Now, if you thought the lives of the wealthy adults were meticulously curated, wait until we delve into the upbringing of their progeny. Because breeding the next generation of billionaires wasn't left to chance. It was a precise, often joyless, exercise in social engineering. From the moment they emerged from their silken swaddling clothes, these children were placed on a trajectory designed to reinforce class, perpetuate privilege, and ensure they fit seamlessly into the gilded cage awaiting them. Their education was a multi-tiered, highly exclusive affair. First came the governesses, often women of impeccable breeding but limited warmth, tasked with instilling manners, basic literacy, and an appropriate sense of superiority. They were the constant, watchful eyes, the primary educators in a childhood often devoid of genuine parental engagement. Then, as the children grew, private tutors filled any perceived academic gaps, preparing them for the next stage, elite boarding schools. Imagine schools where the curriculum focused less on fostering genuine intellect and more on shaping character, instilling discipline, and forging connections with other children of equally privileged backgrounds. These institutions were finishing schools for future power brokers, places where the bonds of class were solidified, often at the expense of individual expression or any genuine intellectual curiosity. And finally, for the young men, the obligatory European Grand Tour. Not for cultural enlightenment, necessarily, but as a final polish, a grand pronouncement of their readiness to inherit the family empire, adorned with a thin veneer of continental sophistication. For the young women, it was less about intellectual discovery and more about collecting appropriate social graces before their grand entrance into society. And what an entrance it was! For young women of the elite, the culmination of their carefully orchestrated upbringing was the debutante ball. Imagine a ritualistic coming-out party, a lavish spectacle of white gowns, delicate gloves, and meticulously choreographed curtsies. But let's strip away the romance, shall we? This was, at its core, a thinly veiled market for suitable, read wealthy, husbands. It was a presentation, a display, a declaration that this young woman, refined and exquisitely trained, was now available for advantageous matrimony. The pressure on these young debutantes was immense. Every detail, from the cut of her gown to the grace of her dance, was scrutinized. Her charm, her wit, her breeding, all were on display, appraised by a room full of potential suitors and their discerning mothers. It was a high-stakes game, played out in grand ballrooms under the glittering gaze of chandeliers, where the prize was a secure, privileged future, often devoid of genuine affection, but rich in financial stability. The pageantry was breathtaking, the underlying reality often quite grim. Because in a world where your worth was so inextricably linked to your family name and your future husband's bank account, personal desires often took a back seat to dynastic expectations. It was a beautiful, suffocating tradition designed to ensure that wealth stayed within its designated circles, generation after gilded generation. And the debutante, shimmering in white, was both the star of the show and its most exquisite pawn. Even in the most impeccably curated golden cages, the gilded bars occasionally rattled. Because even the filthy rich, with all their carefully constructed facades, were still inconveniently human. And when human frailty intersected with unimaginable wealth, the result was often delicious tabloid fodder scandal. Imagine, if you will, the breathless whispers that would ripple through drawing rooms and across bridge tables when news of a high society divorce broke. Not merely a separation, mind you, but a messy, public uncoupling involving accusations of infidelity, disputes over colossal fortunes, and the airing of dirty linen in the most expensive of laundromats. These weren't just divorces. They were seismic events, shaking the very foundations of the social order. Affairs, too, were rampant, often conducted with a discreet wink and a nod, but occasionally exploding into public view with spectacular results. Illicit relationships, kept under wraps for years, could suddenly unravel, bringing down reputations and shattering carefully constructed marriages. The truly juicy revelations often involved the unexpected, the transgressive, a wealthy scion caught with a showgirl, a grande dame entangled with a younger, penniless artist, a forbidden dalliance between family members. Public embarrassments, too, were inevitable. A drunken display at a charity gala, a gambling debt that spiraled out of control, a financial misstep that threatened to expose an empire built on questionable foundations. The press, particularly the burgeoning tabloid newspapers, walked a very fine tightrope, eager to report on the sensationalism, but careful not to bite the hands that indirectly fed them through advertising revenue and social deference. It was a delicate dance between scandalmongering and strategic silence, a fascinating glimpse into the power dynamics of the era. You might think that with unlimited resources, these people could simply buy their privacy, and you'd be mostly right. The elaborate lengths to which the rich went to keep their skeletons in their walk-in closets were truly extraordinary. Private detectives were hired to discreetly manage affairs, often digging up compromising information on rivals to ensure mutual silence. Lawyers drafted ironclad non-disclosure agreements before anyone could so much as breathe a word of a family secret. Sums of money that would astound the average person were quietly exchanged to bury inconvenient truths, to silence persistent rumors, or to ensure that a particularly embarrassing indiscretion never saw the light of day. Entire PR machines, though not called that explicitly, were set in motion to craft narratives, deflect blame, and massage public perception. But despite these Herculean efforts, the thrill when one of these meticulously hidden secrets inevitably tumbled out was palpable. Imagine the delicious shock, the quiet glee when a prominent family's carefully constructed image shattered, revealing the messy human reality beneath. It was a reminder that even limitless wealth couldn't entirely shield you from the fundamental indignities of human existence: lust, greed, jealousy, and folly. And for the rest of us, it offered a brief, satisfying glimpse into the very real, very fallible lives behind the impenetrable facades of Fifth Avenue. Because what's the point of being rich if you can't even keep a good secret, right? It was a constant, unspoken drama, playing out in the pages of the society columns, a testament to the enduring human fascination with the downfall of the mighty. If you possessed untold riches in the 1920s, the common maladies that plagued the general populace were, for you, mere suggestions, minor inconveniences to be dispatched with the utmost discretion and luxury. Health and wellness weren't about public health initiatives or accessible care. They were bespoke services, a private concierge medical experience designed to preserve your precious existence and, more importantly, your impeccable appearance. Imagine having access to the very best doctors. Not just any doctor, but the most renowned specialists in their fields, who would make house calls to your mansion at any hour, no matter how trivial your sniffle or how imaginary your malaise. Sanatoriums, those grand, often isolated retreats, weren't just for tuberculosis. They were for nervous exhaustion, a polite euphemism for the arduous task of being rich and bored. You could check in to one of these palatial institutions, surrounded by pristine nature and attentive staff, to recover from the strenuous demands of social engagements, or perhaps the profound effort of having nothing to do. Cures for various ailments, often vaguely defined and entirely unproven by modern science, were readily available, from elaborate hydrotherapy treatments to specialized diets delivered by private chefs. The wealthy had the luxury of a leisurely approach to personal well-being, where illness was an excuse for luxurious repose, and recovery was a matter of indulging in every conceivable comfort. While the masses worried about affording a single doctor's visit, the elite had entire medical teams on retainer, ensuring their continued, if somewhat pampered, existence. But it wasn't just about curing ailments. It was about preventing the most terrifying disease of all, aging. The pursuit of perpetual youth became a fashionable obsession, leading to a proliferation of exclusive spa retreats and questionable health fads. Imagine traveling to a grand resort, perhaps in Baden-Baden or Vichy, where you could take the waters, undergoing a series of elaborate mineral baths and bizarre internal cleansing rituals, all promising to restore your youthful vigor. Exclusive beauty salons offered groundbreaking and often dangerous treatments, from chemical peels to nascent forms of plastic surgery, all designed to erase the indignities of time. Fashionable diets, often devoid of any scientific basis, swept through high society, promising svelte figures and renewed energy. Imagine subsisting on a diet of only grapefruit and cottage cheese, not for health reasons, but because it was the current it fad among your social set. Exercise, too, became a refined activity. Private gymnastics lessons, specialized physiotherapy, gentle walks in meticulously manicured gardens. These weren't about breaking a sweat or building muscle. They were about maintaining an elegant silhouette and a veneer of effortless vitality. It was a constant, expensive battle against the inevitable, a desperate attempt to defy mortality through sheer force of wealth. Because in a world where appearances were everything, the ultimate luxury was to appear eternally young, eternally vibrant, and utterly untouched by the common afflictions of humanity. After all, who wants to look merely rich when you can look ageless? Now, one might imagine that with all this excess, with all this relentless social maneuvering, there would be little room for anything as profound as art and culture. And you'd be wrong, but not entirely. For the filthy rich of the 1920s, art wasn't just something to be appreciated, it was something to be possessed. It was another luxury item, another investment, another opportunity for patronage that doubled as self-aggrandizement. Imagine yourself commissioning a portrait, not because you desperately needed a visual representation of your soul, but because a renowned artist's brushstrokes on your canvas conferred a certain cultural legitimacy, a quiet nod to your sophisticated taste, or your very deep pockets. The art world, then as now, revolved around those with the means to acquire. Private collections, amassed over decades, often featured European masters, Renaissance sculptures, or burgeoning Impressionist works, not always out of genuine aesthetic appreciation, but because they were tangible assets, conversation starters, and eventual legacies. These collections would, of course, after their owner's demise, often become the nuclei of public museums, bearing the family name for eternity. So, a little culture, a little public service, and a whole lot of tax write-off. It was a brilliant self-serving cycle, ensuring that the legacy of their wealth extended beyond mere real estate and into the hallowed halls of cultural institutions. They were not just consumers of art, they were its accidental custodians, shaping public taste by the sheer volume of their acquisitions. And what of the vibrant cultural landscape of the Roaring Twenties? The true roar that echoed far beyond their gilded cages. Oh, they engaged with it, selectively, of course. Theater, particularly the more respectable, highbrow productions, was a favored pastime. Imagine an evening at the opera, dressed in your finest, occupying a private box, not necessarily to appreciate the intricate melodies, but to be seen appreciating them, to make a statement about your cultured sensibilities. Jazz, that scandalous, exhilarating new sound, was a different matter. It was embraced, but on their own terms. Not in the smoky, democratic dance halls of Harlem, but in exclusive jazz clubs, often hidden in the basements of their own mansions, or in private venues where the right people could mingle without the uncomfortable presence of, well, everyone else. They consumed culture as another luxury item, another commodity to be purchased and displayed. It was an aesthetic accessory, much like a diamond necklace or a custom automobile. The real, visceral energy of the Jazz Age, the spontaneous creativity, the defiance, the raw emotion, often remained just out of reach, filtered through the gauze of their privilege. They dipped their toes in the cultural currents, but rarely plunged into the depths. Because true immersion might mean encountering perspectives that challenge their carefully constructed worldview, and that, my dear friends, was a discomfort they could simply purchase their way out of. They preferred their culture sanitized, presented, and preferably framed. So, we've painted a rather vivid picture of glittering excess, of boundless indulgence, and of a life lived so far removed from ordinary human experience, it bordered on the surreal. But beneath this impossibly shiny veneer, lurking beneath the champagne bubbles and the rustle of silk, was a quiet, insidious anxiety. Because when your entire existence is a performance, the constant, unspoken stress of upholding an image of effortless perfection and boundless wealth becomes a suffocating burden. Imagine the relentless pressure to always be impeccably dressed, to always say the right thing, to never commit a social faux pas that could ripple through the society columns like an earthquake. The fear of social missteps, of being seen as less than perfect, was a constant shadow. A misplaced fork, an ill-timed joke, a perceived slight to a more powerful family, any of these could jeopardize your standing in a world where reputation was currency. But perhaps the greatest, most visceral fear was the chilling prospect of losing it all. Imagine inheriting a colossal fortune, a legacy of generations, and being the one to let it slip through your fingers. The unspoken dread of financial ruin, of falling from grace, was a constant companion, despite the outward bravado. It was the fear of becoming, God forbid, ordinary. The beautiful, terrible irony was that these individuals, who seemingly had everything, were often tormented by the fear of having nothing, or rather, of having less than everyone else in their rarefied circle. And this, my friends, brings us to the darkly reflective segment, the true cost of privilege. Beneath the shimmering surface of material excess, there often lay a profound emotional and spiritual emptiness. When every whim is catered to, every challenge removed, every desire fulfilled, what is left to strive for? What truly brings meaning? The relentless pursuit of social ascendancy, the endless cycle of parties and acquisitions often left these individuals feeling utterly isolated, disconnected from genuine human emotion and purpose. Imagine a life where your closest relationships are transactional, where your children are raised by staff, where your conversations are primarily superficial. The laughter might be loud, the champagne might flow freely, but there was often a profound loneliness that permeated their grand homes and their lavish lives. It was the crushing weight of having everything and yet feeling nothing, hidden beneath layers of champagne and silk, of polite smiles and carefully chosen words. The golden cage, for all its material splendor, was still a cage. And often, the richest among them were the most imprisoned, trapped by their own expectations, their own image, and the profound, silent emptiness that only limitless privilege can truly bestow. It was a high price to pay for a life of effortless luxury, a haunting whimper beneath the triumphant roar. As the decade roared on, its soundtrack a frantic jazz melody overlaid with the steady clinking of champagne glasses, subtle cracks began to appear in the meticulously constructed facade of opulence. For those paying close attention, the economic warning signs were there, discreetly, almost politely, hinting at an unsustainable future. But the wealthy, insulated within their gilded bubbles, largely ignored or dismissed them. After all, if you were doing so spectacularly well, surely the entire system wasn't on the brink of collapse. That was a problem for other people, for the working class, for the farmers, for anyone who hadn't had the foresight to be born into unimaginable wealth. Imagine a quiet whisper of over-speculation in the stock market, dismissed as merely the natural exuberance of a robust economy. Or a faint murmur about rising consumer debt, shrugged off as a temporary blip. Agricultural crises, unemployment in certain sectors, growing income inequality, these were distant drumbeats, easily drowned out by the frenetic rhythm of their own lavish parties. They were like passengers on a grand, luxurious ocean liner, oblivious to the iceberg just beyond the horizon, convinced that their vessel was unsinkable, their course unalterable. The unsustainable nature of their economic model, built on a foundation of unchecked speculation and a widening chasm between rich and poor, was a concept simply too inconvenient, too existentially threatening to truly consider. They were too busy enjoying the party to notice the faint tremors beneath their polished marble floors. And so we arrive at the unseen abyss, the impending stock market crash, a distant, unimaginable threat to most of these individuals, yet a stark reality waiting patiently in the wings to devour their painstakingly accumulated fortunes. For many, it would arrive not as a slow, creeping dread, but as a sudden, brutal shock. One day, you were a titan of industry, a financial demigod whose word moved markets. The next, your meticulously constructed empire was collapsing like a house of cards, your fortune evaporating into thin air. The crash of 1929 was not merely an economic event. It was a societal earthquake, an ultimate punchline delivered with brutal, unforgiving precision. It exposed the fragility beneath the bravado, the terrifying vulnerability of wealth built on illusion. Imagine the sickening realization that your yachts, your mansions, your countless servants were suddenly liabilities, monuments to a vanished age. It was the cosmic joke of the century, a cruel twist of fate that stripped away the layers of pretense, forcing many of these individuals to confront a reality they had so meticulously avoided. The roar of the 20s would soon become a whimper, and the gilded cage, for many, would finally splinter, revealing the harsh, cold light of an entirely different, far less accommodating era. And for some, the fall would be long, painful, and utterly, deliciously poetic. And so the curtain falls. Or rather, the entire set collapses with a spectacular, albeit tragic, crunch. After the cataclysm of 1929, what happened to many of these fortunes and families? The aftermath was a somber, melancholic epilogue to an era of unapologetic, vulgar opulence. For some, the fall was swift and absolute. Fortunes, once measured in dozens of millions, evaporated overnight, leaving behind a trail of ruined lives, empty mansions, and the lingering scent of desperation. Yachts were repossessed, art collections auctioned off for pennies on the dollar, and the invisible army of servants dispersed,
leaving these once grand homes eerily silent, echoing with the ghosts of forgotten parties. Some families, those with deeper, more diversified pockets, or simply better luck, managed to weather the storm, though not without significant adjustments.
The sheer extravagance of the 1920s became unfashionable, even grotesque, in the stark reality of the Great Depression. The roaring excesses gave way to a quieter, more subdued form of wealth, a lesson learned in the harshest possible way. For many, the golden cage had shattered, forcing them out into a world they had so diligently avoided, a world where the problems they once dismissed as for other people now became terrifyingly real. It was the end of an era, a final, definitive period mark on a chapter of history that truly believed its own hype. What remains of their extravagant lives today? Much, actually. Their grand buildings, the Fifth Avenue mansions, the sprawling estates of Long Island, many have been repurposed. Some are museums, monuments to an age of unparalleled excess, where you can now wander through gilded halls and marvel at the sheer, unadulterated scale of their former lives. Others are now exclusive clubs, schools, or even split into luxury apartments, still commanding exorbitant prices, yet lacking the singular, autocratic vision of their original owners. Their names, too, linger on: Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Astor, etched into the foundations of institutions, immortalized in city landmarks, woven into the very fabric of American lore. And the stories, of course, persist, the almost mythical tales of their excess, their outrageous parties, their absurd demands. They are whispered, recounted, and perhaps a little exaggerated with each telling. A lingering, sleepy reminder of the transient nature of even the most filthy wealth. Because money, as it turns out, can buy you many things, but it cannot buy immunity from the fickle hand of fate, or the inevitable march of time, or the ultimate ironic punchline of history itself. So, as the last strains of that distant jazz fade, and the echo of a forgotten laughter finally dies, perhaps we can all rest easy. Good night, or good morning. History, after all, keeps turning, whether you're awake for it or not. If you've managed to stay awake through this entire, exhausting tour of unimaginable privilege and profound boredom, congratulations. Your endurance is commendable, perhaps even a little alarming. Don't feel obligated, but if you're inclined to encourage further investigations into the bizarre corners of human history, a subscription would be noticed. Or don't. History doesn't care.